What we're trying to look at is how technology is evolving, how it's developing, how it can be used, how political parties manifest that technology is going to be for them to understand.
So you mentioned earlier that the UK and the US have very different approaches to personal data, opt-in versus opt-out. Which is the right one?
That's difficult. Look, as a CEO of a technology company, clearly I'm very excited about the development of these types of technologies and what data can be used for in the future. The more permissive the society and the legislation, the more opportunity there is to develop products and services that can really help, not just in politics, but across a huge range of areas, and social and healthcare and government, information policy initiatives and so forth that can be really targeted to help people in all sectors of society, as well as the commercial and brand space. So
that's an argument for
on the one hand, that's a very compelling argument, but clearly you have to protect the individuals. We understand that, and which is why we work very closely with the legislative bodies and the governing bodies in each country to make sure that we comply with the legislation that's in place.
What about voter suppression as a tactic? Is that a morally defensible approach for a political campaign, to try and encourage you not to use your vote?
Well, that's certainly not something that we engage in. It is something that I've seen reported in the media in countries around the world. I mean, I think it's...
And the data analytics could be a very powerful tool if you wish to run that sort of a political campaign, couldn't it?
Well, I think no more powerful than any mass media. I mean, the television could be seen as a powerful tool to suppress votes, as could the radio and
surely,
any other
just
channel.
as you've been setting out to encourage me to use my vote, data analytics is, as you've just been setting out, a very powerful, much more powerful tool than broadcast identical TV ads to 200.
Well, what you're trying to do with targeted engagement is to share with the voters in a particular political situation the relative pros and cons of each candidate and each issue or policy initiative that those candidates are advocating. So, I certainly think that targeted communication can be used to point out the negative qualities of the opposition candidate that you're fighting against. But I think, I'd like to think that all companies that work in election campaigns, such as our own, believe in democracy because it is our business, and that we try and encourage people to vote, rather than try and disencourage them, or dissuade them from voting. We're trying to just encourage them to vote in the way that's obviously in the interests of our clients or candidates. Yeah.
So am I wrong then in believing that voter suppression is one of the data analytical tools that various political campaigns have been experimenting with in the last few years?
Well, I can't speak for any other firms. I certainly can't speak for what was happening on the other side of the aisle in America with the Democrats, but on the Republican side, those practices were never engaged in.
Okay, that's interesting. Change subject slightly, as the digital world becomes the primary, most cost-efficient means of campaigning, how do we make sure that people who are not online are not excluded from the political debate?
Well, I think that's going to be complex initially, but what we are seeing is a shift away from communication that's computer-based to obviously smartphones, and smartphone penetration is growing exponentially across even developing countries. And so people will be receiving much more communications, advertising communications through their smartphones. And that includes, text and social media and obviously other forms of digital banner advertising and so forth. So I think that's going to help bridge the gap, long before everyone's privileged enough to own a laptop or a desktop computer.
So if you take the UK, for example, we don't have to travel as far as Africa. There are about 5 million adults in the UK who are not online in any way, shape or form. There are about 10 million who don't have basic digital skills, couldn't send an email, don't know how to do a Google search, wouldn't be able to fill in an online form. How do we make sure that as the democratic process moves digitally, that those individuals are still part of the democratic debate?
Well, look, this is not digital communication at the exclusion of other channels. This is just an additional channel. So TV,
but an additional channel that will be taking more and more of the budget.
It will be, but you look at
for consumer
party
businesses.
political spending in the UK and in the US. Television still dominates across both sides of the Atlantic and in most countries around the world, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Albeit it will be more data-driven and targeted, which is going to be a really interesting and exciting evolution. But television, radio, door-to-door canvassing, leaflets, direct mail, text messaging, and so forth. These are all very powerful tools, and we're trying to use data in campaigns to target people across all channels.
Okay.
We're lucky that we have another arrow in our quiver, but it's not at the exclusion of the other channels.
And how worried should we be that the digital, particularly social media, is becoming an echo chamber where I follow people who agree with me. I therefore only see things in my Facebook feed that are things that I'm likely to agree with. How do we make sure that people hear both sides of a political argument before they make up their minds?
Well, I mean, I think you've got a very good point there. I think social media people can become quite entrenched in surrounding themselves with like-minded individuals, and therefore subject to that subjectivity, if you like. But because of the other channels of communication, I think most people, and newspapers as well, sorry if I failed to mention that, most people are exposed to different arguments. If they choose to cocoon themselves...
Isn't there quite a lot of evidence that shows that's not actually the case, particularly in the US? That there are large groups of the population who are only receiving their news through the echo chamber of social media?
Well, I haven't seen that research, but I'd like to think not. I'd like to think that most people in the US certainly have access to at least mainstream media, whether that's newspapers or television or radio, in addition to online forums and social media.
So our democracy is dependent on those old-fashioned channels surviving then?
Look, everyone loves to look at new technology, emerging technology, and suggest the world is changing rapidly and everything that happened before is dead, and we're entering some sort of new phase of uncharted territory. In my limited experience and looking back at history, nothing really moves that fast. The television didn't radically change elections across the world when it was introduced in the 50s and 60s. It certainly had an impact, and I think the same is true with the digital revolution and now the data revolution.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you, actually, Alexander. It's 100 years next year that female suffrage became legal in the UK. And I would argue that the Industrial Revolution, the growth of adult literacy, played a very important part in the evolution of democracy in this country to make sure that it became a genuinely representative democracy for everyone. We're only 90 years since all women, as opposed to older women with property, would have had the vote. And I think technology played a very big part in that. I think that we should have bigger ambitions for the digital world in how digital is going to enhance democracy over the next 50 years in the same way that the printing press and electricity did 100 years ago. What do you think that companies like Cambridge Analytica can do to enhance the democratic process? We spent most of this interview talking about the risks.
Yeah,
Talk to me about what you do enhances democratic engagement.
As I said right at the beginning of this interview, we're a technology company. We're trying to develop products and services within the data and ad tech space in order to allow messaging and communication to become more personalized and more targeted. We're not a political communications company per se. We're creating these tools and we're sharing them with different sectors in society so that they can then use them to achieve their objectives. I suppose our responsibility will be to develop as many tools in the best possible way, such that political parties or democratic organizations can then roll them out to achieve the objectives that you've been talking about.
Because I suspect if we had the team from Momentum in the room with us, they would argue that digital's been a hugely powerful tool in bringing more young people into the democratic process.
Well, that has to be a positive thing as well.
I'm
but
answering
it's
your
not at
question for you.
it's not at the exclusion of everyone else.
No, agree.
Opening up a new channel is going to clearly open up new audiences. But again, that's not necessarily our responsibility at this stage. What we're trying to look at is how technology is evolving, how it's developing, how it can be used, how political parties manifest that technology is going to be for them to understand.
So how do you ensure, as a technology CEO, that your technologists, your software engineers, your data analysts have got the right moral compass in their work? How do you think about that?
Any company, technology or otherwise,
Yeah.
is the sum of its parts. And we'd like to think that by pulling together, obviously, very talented, educated people from very disparate backgrounds and ideologies, by bringing them together into one organization, we get a balanced viewpoint and opinion on how these technologies should be developed and applied.